to ensure that justice be done.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is my first opportunity to speak in the House since I was given the role of Labour's spokesperson on the environment, and I'd like to just begin my contribution by thanking and acknowledging all those members from across the House and, of course, in my own party who've been good enough to congratulate me on that responsibility. I'm looking forward to working in it, Sir. Sir, when I spoke on the budget in the last week that Parliament sat, I mentioned that it failed to mention the environment once, and that is a major omission. I also said that it was a dangerous gamble, Sir, because it contains revenue assumptions that won't survive any further worsening of international economic conditions. But, Sir, there's another major problem with the budget and with the economic policies that accompany it, Sir. They mean that for fixed, low and middle income earners, everyday Kiwis, day-to-day living costs are going to rise steeply. And the National Party knows this, Sir, because they've tried to hide it, saying that no New Zealander will be left worse off than they were before the budget. Well, Sir, on this side of the House we can see through that, because once we do the maths, taking into account price rises, interest rate rises, like the OCR rise yesterday, ACC levy rises, the ETS's effect on power and petrol price rises, and the GST increase, all at a time of nil wage growth, it's obvious, Sir, that the very people who need and deserve help are not going to get it from this government. Sir, the budget's not fair. Despite all the rhetoric, it's a budget that simply caters to the few. It harms our many hard-working families. Let's look at where most of the money is going. Fully a third of the value of the tax cuts will go to the top 5% of the population, and fully 15% of the value of those tax cuts go to the top 1% of income earners in New Zealand. And Sir, how is the National Party going to fund this? Well, Sir, they're doing two things, and they're both unfair and unwise. First, they're borrowing to fund these tax cuts, an extra $50 million of debt for all New Zealanders just to give a big boost to the very best off. Sir, that's just not sensible, and it's not fair to saddle ordinary hard-working people with an extra $1 billion of debt just to reward an elite few. Borrowing to fund tax cuts is at best stupid, and when there is an inequitable, as these tax cuts are, Sir, it's also immoral. The government knows this because in the executive summary to the documents of the budget, there is found the following quote: "It would be, quote, grossly inappropriate to saddle future generations with debt for tax cuts," end quote, Sir, even though that's exactly what the resulting legislation does. But, Sir, the budget's unfair because it also claims, on the one hand, not to leave anyone worse off, whereas in reality it has just hidden the many extra costs that it burdens the majority of New Zealanders with. It will disadvantage those already struggling and reward those who need the least help. Let's take an example, an average worker earning $50,000 a year. The budget claims at face value that this worker would get an extra $29 a week, leaving them $16 better off each week when you take into account the extra $13 a week in GST. But, Sir, in claiming this, the government have ignored some very obvious factors pointed out by Treasury to create an illusion. They know this worker won't be better off. They know they're making him and the many others like him worse off. There's no taking into account the estimated 6% inflation that the country will face in the coming year. And so that's not something that slips the mind too easily. If it's been omitted, it's safe to say that that's intentional, Mr. Speaker. The reason the National Party have failed to take inflation into account in the information given to ordinary Kiwis is that this would expose how our average worker would actually end up losing $19 a week thanks to the higher inflationary prices. That's just not fair. And if we take into account increased ACC levies, costs to the worker if he has a student loan outstanding, ECE cost increases, higher power prices and higher taxes on things like rent and tobacco, our average worker could in reality end up $30 a week worse off than he was before the budget, Sir. And still the worker will be getting worse off because, as we saw last year, we're in times of relatively low or nil real wage growth. I can't, Sir, for the life of me see what's fair or good about that. So, Sir, the budget and the propaganda surrounding it have been deceptive. I'd say it's because the government knows that what they're doing is wrong, and because they know that you can't morally justify taking from the many to give to the few. It is a budget of broken promises, Sir, and, Sir, it is one for which the government will be judged.